Phone's turned off.
On the glasses.
Are your phone ringers turned off?
Yeah.
Good.
This is the thing. Daddy, you don't know about this. I'm wearing glasses since I was 8.
I just started.
Kiki, is it good to announce in the tent now? Are you good to be announced?
Yeah, I think we're about ready. I just want to...
No, we're
So
good.
2 minutes. Chris, a thumbs up when you
Yeah,
want to
ready.
we're going. I think we're live.
We're live.
We're live. We're streaming.
But in terms of the audio.
Yes. Yeah, it sounds really cool.
Cleanest thing I've ever been?
Yeah, inflatable planetarium. It's such a great idea.
Oh, wow, I didn't see it.
Yeah, look at that.
That's pretty cool. That will help. What else do you have?
Headphone input off of this one.
Printouts of my stories.
Oh, you have a printer?
In my backpack? Yeah.
Nice.
I have basically all my first stuff. I have my corn bag. I have hand sanitizer and hand lotion.
You say hi to everybody in the chat room.
Do you want to start the announcements and recordings and stuff?
Yeah, I think we are about ready. Well, not yet. And I think it's just about time.
Interplanetary. Sure.
Dunne.
Madonna. Kesha.
I'm the one named
I'm thumbsing upping. Thumbsing upping. Right on time. It's amazing. Look at us, be professionals.
I think we do this normally.
This is TWIS. This Week in Science, episode number 725 and a half. Recorded on Saturday, June 15th, 2019, live from the Interplanetary Festival. Welcome everyone, I'm Dr. Kiki, and today we will fill your heads with space, adventure, and humans. But first...
Disclaimer, disclaimer, disclaimer. For all the certainty with which humanity sets its course and seizes opportunities where it can, we rarely contemplate our destination, allowing far too often for tendencies of mankind's impulses to push us forward, fulfilling the immediate needs of safety and security, comfort and greed. The steps taken by humanity far too often are in reaction to where our last steps have left us standing, as if we never have a destination in mind. When seen from afar, the course of humanity often looks more like the drunken stagger of an infant learning to walk than the steady steps of a progressing society. And when we have no destination in mind, we choose one by default. And so, in this world of changing climate, it is the destination we have chosen. Melting ice caps is the destination we have chosen. Rising sea waters is the destination we have chosen. Flooded cities is the destination we have chosen. The death of the coral reefs, the source of half the oxygen that we breathe, is the destination we have chosen. Agricultural drought, ensuing famine, extreme weather events, all sorts affecting everywhere, is the destination we have chosen by not choosing. And as we stagger off the right foot and hopefully catch ourselves with the left, we might turn this drunken stumble of a society in a direction of our own choosing. One that sets a course with a destination in mind. One that will ultimately lead us to This Week in Science, coming up next. And this is where we normally have music in our dancing, so we'll just pretend. Everybody pretend that the music is booming right now.
There it is!
There we go. It'll catch up.
I've got the kind of mind that can't get enough.
science to you, Kiki and Blair.
And good science to you too, Justin, Blair, and everyone joining us today at the Interplanetary Festival in Santa Fe. Thank you all for coming out. The Interplanetary Festival is something else. I have been having such a good time here, meeting so many interesting people everywhere I go. The conversations are out of this world. Kind of, yeah. Anyway. On this week's show, on today's show, very special show being here, we have stories that are themed up a little bit about the theme of humanity and where we're going into space, where we've been in our past. I have stories about how we age in Europa's oceans, and we have an interview with Dr. Jennifer Dunne from SFI coming up. What do you have for us, Justin?
I've got impossible pterodactyls, ancient cannabis, and losing history to sea level rise.
Optimistic things. Gonna leave us feeling good. Blair, can the Animal Corner bring us happiness today?
That's only if you enjoy Beewolves, mantis shrimps, and peer pressure.
Beewolves, that's not Beowulf.
No, it's
No.
a little bit different.
Okay, well, we're looking forward to learning about that. As we jump into the show, I would like to remind everyone that if you are not already subscribed, you can find the TWIS podcast, all places that podcasts are found, iTunes, Google, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, radio.com, TuneIn, or you can just go to our website, twis.org. You'll find all the information there. Should we jump into stories, or do you guys want to reflect a little bit on the festival so far?
Have you enjoyed the festival, Justin?
Oh yeah, this is an amazing venue to begin with, and then diversity of things. I've been just wandering around getting enthralled all morning.
I heard you were having a deep conversation about comic books with James S.A. Corey.
Yes.
Things have happened. Blair, have you had any neat interactions?
Yeah, I saw some amazing art. I saw a polar bear in New Mexico, which was interesting.
I did not expect that.
Yeah, but I also learned why your blood boils in space, if you were in space.
If you were in space, do tell.
Yeah, well, it's because you're in a vacuum. I always assumed, since they said, oh, if you didn't wear your spacesuit in space, your blood would boil. I picture, boiling like hot. No, same temperature, but because of the lack of pressure, the boiling point is lowered so drastically that your blood just boils and eventually would actually freeze. So there's a booth outside. You can find more about that.
Yeah, and note to self, don't go into space without a spacesuit.
Yeah. Otherwise, I might have wanted to do it, but now, for sure, spacesuits only.
Yeah. What about going someplace like Europa? A moon of Jupiter. Anybody interested in, if you were given a space trip to Europa, would you go? We've got a show of hands here. There are a few gutsy people here in the audience. Yes, Europa. News out this week has the Hubble telescope looking at Europa in the visible spectrum of light, and they have seen light signatures indicating salty water, sodium chloride, on the surface of Europa. And now you might think, okay, the surface, what's going on there? Well, the term for the cracks and the jaggedness on the surface of Europa, its icy surface, has been broken apart, and there are these big gaps in it. It's called chaos terrain. Chaos terrain, this is one of my favorite terms. Around these areas that have been broken open, what it's allowed to happen is warmer water that's not frozen beneath that icy surface to come out, to get out onto the surface, to spew out through these vents, and to leave a telltale signature. They used to think that the oceans of Europa were salty, but not like Earth's oceans. They thought it was more sodium sulfates, which are great, but not necessarily as conducive for life. And now we have evidence of sodium chloride, like good old table salt, this stuff also that is it is in our oceans and allows for liquid water and allows for many of the metabolic interactions of life that take place. And so the bigger question, I mean, we've been looking at Europa for a long time as potentially, because it has these watery oceans under the surface, potentially to hold microbial life. And now knowing that there might really be salt water under there, it might be life that's even more similar to the microbial life we find here on Earth. So let's go. Let's go there.
Absolutely.
Now.
And this is just another example of how we're not special. We keep thinking we're special. Everything that's happened here is so unusual, but chances are there's other stuff out there that's like us, that's like this, something of that nature. Lots of aliens around here has me thinking that way, of course. But this is a perfect example, something that potentially could hold life like we know it pretty easily.
Yeah. Very exciting. So we made Enceladus, Europa, the number of moons in our solar system that might have life. It's increasing, getting more and more exciting.
And even if we do find life on Europa or other places, it's still special.
That's right. I'm sorry. I grew up with Mr. Rogers. I should know better. Everyone's special.
In our own way, even the purple panda. Even though he was terrifying to me as a young child. I don't know why. Moving on. Humans, right? We don't want to get old. We'd like to live long, healthy lives. We'd like to age well so that we can go to space, right? And live those long lives out in space. And so there are big questions people are asking about how we age, why we age. Why does it turn out that somewhere around your 50s, 60s, 70s, things start breaking down and you're just not as bouncy as you once were when you were younger? Aging takes its toll, and as people are telling you to take your probiotics, take your supplements, do all these various things to stay younger longer, we really don't know the mechanisms behind aging. We know that our chromosomes have telomeres on the end, and those telomeres get broken down every time a cell divides. Each time a cell divides, like little scissors, snip those telomeres away, and when the telomeres are gone, they don't protect your DNA anymore. Your DNA is subject to damage much more easily. And so telomeres are this big picture that we've been looking into. But a new study that just came out in the Journal of Aging Cell, researchers have been looking at more the genetic instructions that actually lead to changes in gene activity, the genes that control the metabolic pathways that control what's going on in our cells, how they divide, how they use energy, how they stay young, or if they do. And this recent study that was just published, they looked at neurons and muscle tissue. They looked at RNA in these tissues and discovered that there is a lot of DNA that changes in the way that it gets expressed right around age 60. Somewhere around 60 years old. And this study has pretty much put this nail in this idea that organisms like humans go on this linear developmental track where your body changes in a very similar way for X amount of time. But then at 60, our bodies start expressing the proteins that keep the body healthy differently. So you're more prone to getting cancer, for instance. And so now we maybe have some genes to start looking at as targets for anti-aging treatments that might be able to keep us healthier and younger longer. Would you want to stay younger and healthier longer?
I mean, I have gone long on record saying that I want to live at least 200 years. So anything that can help with that, I am all about. Yeah.
Would you like to live, say, as long as a bat?
Longer, please.
Well, maybe proportionally as long as a bat?
Sure. Related to body size? Is that
related to body size? Yeah, and so the reason I asked this question is that there is another study along these lines looking at how genes are expressed, but not in humans, in bats. It turns out that animals seem to have the length of time that they live and the speed of their metabolism is directly related to their size, the body size. So larger organisms have slower metabolisms and tend to live longer. Humans, elephants live longer, slower metabolisms. Mice, they just run around in their little wheels and then they die. Bats, however, tend to have much longer lifespans than they should given their body size. And so the researchers started looking into the genes that are active in bats. And so like the last study that found in humans, there are a number of genes that turn off or stop working as well around age 60. What happens in bats is they just keep on making those genes work. They never turn them off. And so the researchers think that because they are small size and they have to put up with the stress and the rigor of flying, that it might be having evolved flight may have led them to develop these metabolic longevity resources.
It's almost like overcompensating.
Overcompensating,
So
yes.
Are you suggesting that instead of running or bicycling, I should just be flapping my arms?
Yeah.
Learn to fly, Justin.
And then also get some gravity boots.
And sleep during the day.
Yeah.
And sleep during the day. And
Upside
gravity
down.
boots. Oh, that's good.
Upside down.
I'm already liking it. I can do this lifestyle. I can handle this.
Live like a bat, just don't give me
We got a
rabies.
question from
What
the
could
audience?
go wrong?
Yeah. We have a question from the audience.
When they reach that point where the genes would turn off, like parallel analogous to a human 60,
Yeah.
are they still reproductively viable?
So the question is, are they still reproductively viable when that in that time frame in which we would normally be switching off the genes and that allow us the longevity?
That's a great question. I do not know the answer to that question, but
We don't
that
know
would
the
be
answer to the
very
question, but you
interesting.
may have just offered somebody in the audience a PhD thesis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would guess that
sounds like a
either they are still reproductively viable, or they are helping raising young from other individuals they're related to or they share space with, because otherwise there wouldn't be much evolutionary reason to them living any longer. So there has to be something that would help their DNA by them living longer.
Yeah, we've talked on the show a lot before, very often related to stories in Blair's Animal Corner, about the idea that older animals have the experience to help raise younger animals. And so especially in social animals, they're more likely to live to longer ages because they have that ability to benefit the younger generations in a way that is a positive feedback for the entire population.
Yeah, some of the most famous ones are chimps and orcas. Those have been in the news a lot lately with the grandmother hypothesis of helping out with the younger offspring.
So yay for grandmothers.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, that does it for my opening stories. Justin, what do you have?
Archaeological evidence of human coastal occupation in the form of shell mounds are commonly found on shorelines in many places across the planet. This is one of the ways we have tracked human migration, is by looking at these shell mounds and saying, humans stayed here, they opened lots of shellfish, and then they moved on. So we can actually see some places as back as 164,000 years where this activity was taking place. But within that time frame, sea levels have changed many times. Dramatically, the shorelines have moved on the scale of kilometers up and down, which, if you're not familiar with the scale of kilometers, it's approximately the same scale as thousands of meters. Is that right? This is a study published in PLOS ONE reveals that this change in coastlines have impacted the majority of shell mounds that have been created through the ages. So those that we can see, based on this study, are within about 6,000 years, because there was an ice age where the sea sort of recessed, and then it actually was a few meters higher than it is now, and it's been going down over the last 2,000 years, minus the last 20 or so. So a lot of our prehistory and a lot of our assumptions about where humans traveled and how long they were there is missing this data. So we're sort of suggesting perhaps that we need to start outfitting our archaeologists with some snorkeling gear and going out and doing some digging, because this is also going to be covered up under sediment. But it's sort of like interesting too, because if we think about it, this is about to happen again. As sea levels rise, majority of our population lives within that what is expected if we lose Antarctica. We'll have about a 15-meter increase in sea level.
Yeah. So in California, where both of us are from, about 80% of the population in California is on the coast.
Yeah. This is kind of a big deal. So I know I'm talking to people here in beautiful Santa Fe, 7,000 feet. Right? Nobody here is really worried. about the sea level rise. But I want you to think about it a little bit differently, because there will be tens, if not hundreds of millions of people from California, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C., who will be looking to move to higher ground, okay? Suddenly the idea of a wall isn't as objectionable when you start thinking of these American migrants trying to get into your community. But yes, this is a bigger issue, even if you're not on a coastal area. It means a gigantic population of people by the end of this century likely will have to migrate to somewhere else in this country. And there's not as much high ground that's populated right now, so something to think about. The other story, turns out cannabis cultivation has been around a little bit longer than we thought. This is saying psychoactive cannabis compounds were preserved in a 2,500-year-old funerary incense burner in the eastern Pamirs Mountains of western China, eastern Tajikistan. And it shows that people at the time were selecting plants for higher THC content. This is Robert Spangler, lead archaeobotanist for the study, had this to say about the find. The new study demonstrates that already 2,500 years ago, humans were potentially targeting specific plants for their chemical production. It's a wonderful example of how closely intertwined humans are and have been with the biotic world around them, that we impose evolutionary pressures on the plants to preserve what we want from them. So, what's sort of also interesting about this, we have already known that for 4,000 years in China they were using the seeds of cannabis for oils and the like, but we don't actually have a lot of evidence for it being used recreationally or ceremonially over the time. There is an account, however, from, let me see if I can find this. This is a 3,000-year-old Persian-born Greek historian, Herodotus, who in his book Histories just has a couple of passages. And here he was talking about some nomads that he encountered. And he says, crawling in under mats, they throw it on red-hot stones, where it smolders and sends forth such fumes that no great vapor bath could surpass. The nomads howl in their joy at the vapor bath. And he also goes on to say that the cannabis plant grows both of itself and having been sown. So there's 3,000 years ago, evidence even earlier than this physical discovery, which is now being confirmed by the physical discovery that the timeframes are right, of humans cultivating marijuana for its THC potential.
I think it's really interesting in that we know animals very often incorporate different herbs for potentially their medicinal properties into their nests, into various aspects of their lives. But is it done with this kind of purpose? And then when we talk about humans, of course, we've had cognitive faculties for a long time. And so 2,500 years ago, it was basically us. And so why would there be a question? I mean, people now are cultivating THC for particular medicinal qualities and strengths. I don't see it being a huge surprise that we would have been doing that 2,500 years ago.
And also, it's a very remote region where this is found, but it's also sort of at the center hub of the spice trade. It was the center network of trade in the old world, so you can see this spreading then from this central location out in every direction.
Well, you can see this is almost another argument for why it shouldn't be stigmatized exactly the way that we look at it now in a lot of places, because if it has this long-term history being with us and having some sort of medicinal effect, it's a good reminder, hey, maybe this isn't that weird or unusual or fringe of a thing to be doing.
Yeah. Hence its legalization in so many states.
Yeah.
Right.
But quick tip, even if you're flying between two states where it's legal, you might not want to fly with it. There's still there's sort of in-between regulations, it turns out.
That's right.
Oh yeah, that's the thing.
It's good to know.
Sounds like you might be speaking from personal experience.
Helpful tips. You know what? I think it's time for that wonderful part of our show, Blair's Animal Corner.
With Blair.
She loves our creatures, great and small. Biped, millipede, no pet at all. Want to hear about animals? She's your girl. Except for giant pandas and squirrels.
What you got, Blair?
I have Beewolves. It's not Beowulf. I will not read back the Old English I learned in high school of Beowulf.
Okay.
Instead, I will tell you about Beewolves, which are wasps who hunt bees. So this is a study from the University of Regensburg and Mainz and the Max Planck Institute for Chemical Ecology, looking at how European beewolves preserve the bees that they eat for long periods of time for their babies. The European beewolf is a solitary wasp species whose females hunt honeybees, and they have evolved, in this new study they discovered that they've evolved a successful method for food preservation, something that we generally think of as a human thing that we do. We have our refrigerators. Further back, we would dig holes in really cool areas and preserve meat that way, or we would smoke meat. So there's all sorts of things that we would do to preserve our food for longer so that we wouldn't get sick. But it turns out that wasps have their own method for preserving food. So in this process, a female wasp will take up to 5 honeybees into their brood cells where they serve as food for a young beewolf. Delicious bees. Female beewolves prefer to build their nests in sunlit and sandy places, which are a perfect place for mold to grow. In fact, in the lab, they took bees just by themselves, dead bees, and put them in these same sunlit, sandy conditions that the beewolves generally use, and they were overgrown with mold in as little as 1 or as much as 3 days. So it is not very long for those bees to be there for the young wasp stage. So for some reason, these bees are not molding in the beewolf hive. And so they had to figure out exactly what they were doing to preserve these dead bees. They last generally at least 8 to 10 days because that's how long it takes for the baby wasps to develop and come out of their cocoon. So they discovered an amazing mechanism that they started to use, which is shortly after oviposition, which is laying the eggs, the brood cells of beewolves smell like a swimming pool. Yeah, it's not chlorine, it's nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is emitted, it's released into the air, it reacts with atmospheric oxygen and makes nitrogen dioxide, NO2. The NO2 concentrations exceed the occupational exposure limits for humans and most life, but it is enough to kill the mold.
And it doesn't matter if the bees are already dead.
That's horribly depressing, though.
But
'cause
remember-
that means wasps are better at chemistry than I am.
Yeah, you could get that.
Even they can figure it out.
Yeah, but it doesn't kill the baby wasps, which it should. So there's something going on with them that allows them to synthesize this NO and NO2 in there. So in low doses, the nitric oxide adjusts blood pressure and adjusts developmental processes, but higher concentration are in some immune systems of some animals released into specific areas to kill pathogens. It's part of the pathogenic response. But they produce so much, it's something totally kind of unrecognized before. They use the same enzymes that we do to synthesize nitric oxide, but the responsible synthase gene in beewolves has no special characteristics whatsoever. So there is something going on between us, the way that we handle it, and the way that they handle it that's pretty much indetectable, that allows them to be able to live in this environment. They did find a modification in the translation of the gene into protein, which might create the high synthesis rate of nitric oxide in the eggs. Quote,
So it's RNA.
yeah.
RNA is responsible.
It's
There we
always
go.
RNA.
It's
Like,
always
you know that
RNA.
meme, like it's probably aliens. I feel like on our show it's
Probably RNA. Yeah.
Due to so-called alternative splicing, the enzyme in the Beewolf eggs lack a segment, which may be responsible for regulation, which allows them to explode in this enzyme activity, which could help them live in this odd environment.
Yeah, so the Beewolf eggs are producing the nitrous oxide, which which is then through chemical modification is becoming nitrogen dioxide, killing off any mold and fungus. Yet the Beewolves go, I'm growing,
Yep.
and I'm gonna eat this bee, and then they're all happy, and then in 10 days they're young little wasps that emerge from the ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing.
This is totally changing our understanding of this kind of process in life. But the other thing that's really interesting about this is it could have implications for food preservation. We now
Right.
know that nitrous oxide and nitrogen dioxide can be part of this process if we wanted to chemically preserve food for, I don't know, flights into space or something like that.
Right, and if you can do away with some of the chemical, artificial, synthesized products that preserve food at this point in time, maybe food can be healthier, longer,
Yeah.
given different instances. Yeah,
Absolutely.
So does that mean we'll be eating bees in space? Wait, I don't know.
yeah, that's exactly what we were just talking about.
Stingers as you go.
Bees in space.
So I don't know how many of you have been hanging out at the Area 21 beer garden, but you may or may not have participated in some peer pressure in relation to your food or drink choices in the past or during this festival. But a very interesting study from the University of Geneva looks at exactly what's going on there, at least if you are a mouse. This is looking at food preference in animals. There are actually specific neural connections in our neural networks involved in food choice, and there is a potential social transmission in those neural networks. What that means is, in this study, they looked at mice who live in colonies of several dozen individuals, and I didn't know this before, but they usually have a taster mouse who checks to see if the food is safe.
That is the low mouse on the totem pole.
Yeah.
That is-
So, side note, later I'm going to have to go and do all sorts of research to figure out how they choose who the taster mice is, if it's always the same mouse, or if it moves over.
If
I
it's the
don't
same,
know.
yeah, there's just one mouse that's just got bad impulse control, and the other's just like, oh yeah, we'll just sit around.
Yeah,
eventually.
send Larry in there, he'll eat anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they have these taster mice, and they use that to be able to identify what is safe to eat and what is not safe to eat. But how do they pass that information on? Well, in nature, this is another thing I did not know, rodents love thyme, the spice. They don't love cumin. Okay, so apparently...
That's going to be in the trivia later,
Yeah.
folks. Yeah.
Cumin is not naturally occurring very often where these mice live, but in general they will prefer thyme to cumin. And in the lab, the scientists wanted to see what happened if they took two mice. One was a demonstrator and was educated, so trained to appreciate cumin. And after a meal with that spice, they were brought into contact with another mouse, the observer, who had a preference for thyme. The two mice shared the same cage for 30 minutes, and one day later, 24 hours later, two meals were presented just to the observer, one flavored with cumin and one with thyme. The observing mouse actually showed a taste and interest in cumin following that hangout with the previous mouse. So there was some sort of information that went between these two so that they recognized the cumin smell, they recognized those molecules, and they went on to eat it even though they would have avoided it before.
Can I guess?
Yeah.
Breath?
So, that might have something to do with it, for sure. They looked at the neurons engaged during their experiment in the mice to see how this kind of was passed along. They observed that not only did neurons receive information from olfactory, but also that interneural communication was modified. So they learned a new smell that strengthened their synaptic connections, and it modified their natural choice after contact. First, the olfactory system detects the smell. The olfactory cortex then connects to the prefrontal, involved in decision-making choices, which then connects to the ventral striatum, which manages, I'm going to let you go ahead, you're the neuroscientist, which manages motivation and the search for reward. So then they confirmed this with optogenetics, taking this to a whole nother level.
So the brat.
To cancel the neural modification induced by contact. So they went in, they deleted this kind of pathway that was created, and then no more cumin for the mouse. They were like, never mind. What is that? I don't know what that is. So
Who are you? Have I spoken with you before?
Yeah. So they removed the reinforcement, and they lost that response from social contact. So there was a previous history where they had smelled cumin, they had been with that buddy, but they deleted that reinforcement.
Deleted a memory.
Yeah.
Yeah, optogenetics are kind of...
That's the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They
So
deleted the memory of... Wow.
So there's all sorts of stuff going on in your brain with these social reactions. It's not all just emotional response or anything like that. It's hard wiring happening in your brain, telling you to do what other people around you are doing, which is kind of scary.
Or if you're a mouse, eat what other mice are eating.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
But one of the possible applications of this study, which is really interesting, is that this particular mechanism appears to be something that is dysfunctional in neurodevelopmental disorders, like people on the autism spectrum. So this is something where these neural pathways might have to do with their ability to read social contexts. And so if we can identify that and target that through a simple study like this about thyme versus cumin, you might actually be able to improve people's ability to read social situations who have certain disorders.
That could be that could be amazing. Or the other way around, we could program people to ignore social inputs.
I feel like that might be a bad idea. We all live too close together for you to do that.
I don't know, if you've got really low sales resistance and you have a garage full of stuff that you've seen on television that you don't need, maybe
I know, you're buying.
Maybe you go in and get that neuron zapped.
That's a good call.
That's a good call. Thank you for those stories. All right, we are going to take a very quick 2-minute break for me to tell you a few things about This Week in Science. We're coming back with our interview with Jennifer Dunne in just a moment. Stay tuned for more This Week in Science. It broke it. Down, girl. Thank you for coming out today to the Interplanetary Festival. This Week in Science is an independent science podcast, and we do rely on the support of our audience. And so if people like you are interested in helping our little podcast out, you can go to TWIS.org. That's our website, where you can find out how to subscribe to our podcast through iTunes, Google, and also to our video channel on YouTube. You can also find a link to our Zazzle store, where we have lots of cool TWIS products with the TWIS logo, and also artwork from Blair's Animal Corner calendars of many years. We have these lovely calendars. Blair does all the art every year, and they're fun. And you can you can get phone covers and pillows and wrapping paper and other things, and a portion of the proceeds support our program. We also have a Patreon account, and so you can click on the Patreon link and become a regular supporter of This Week in Science, and in return you get some perks from us. If you support us at the $10 a month or more level, you become one of the people that we thank by name at the end of the show. We also have fun things we send, like stickers and t-shirts and other goodies. There are other goodies specifically for our Patreon supporters. But beyond all that, it's really sharing your love of science and telling people about This Week in Science, and subscribing if you have not subscribed previously. We thank you for your support. We really could not do this without you. I told Justin not to go away. Co-hosts.
Hey, don't let me into that.
I said 2 minutes. Good. Okay, let's come back.
And we're back. You're listening to or watching This Week in Science.
Welcome back, everybody. Now it is time for the segment of our show that we love to call This Weekend. What has science done for you lately? And since we are in a live audience situation, I would like to invite, does anybody in the audience have something that comes to mind right now that science has done for them lately? And I'd love for you to come up and share that with us.
No pressure.
No pressure.
So just to give a tiny bit of background, we started doing this right around, I guess, early 2017.
It's about 2 years ago.
Yeah, because there was some de-emphasis on the importance of science in certain realms, and we decided it was important to recognize the little things that science does for us every day, and just kind of a growing recognition of all the different fields out there that have impressions on us in everything that we do. So we have had stories from people who are born premature and may not have survived without medical science, to people whose dog diets are better for science, to people who broadcast weekly like us, thanks to technology, to all sorts of fun things.
Yeah, my big contribution was the dishwasher.
Yes.
Dishwasher.
Science that made a dishwasher possible has completely revolutionized my life.
Absolutely.
Jenna, get up here and let me know. Come here. Let's use a microphone. Come share. Introduce yourself. And
So lately, and through most of my life, I have been completely free of vaccine-preventable diseases, and I would like to thank science for that.
That's a good one.
that was a great
I love my
one.
vaccines.
And Jenna works at the Santa Fe Institute and is one of the wonderful people who has made it possible for us to be here today. So thank you, Jenna, and Caitlin, and Chris, who's helping do the audio today. Thank you. Yes. If anyone is interested in sharing and maybe not being on the air or on the show, telling us what science has done for you lately, send me an email. Kirsten@thisweekinscience.com is my email, or you can leave us a message on our Facebook page. Now, I would love to introduce our guest for the afternoon, Dr. Jennifer Dunne. She is professor and vice president for science at the Santa Fe Institute, co-founder and co-director of the Pacific Eco-Informatics and Computational Ecology Lab, editor in Ecology Letters and the Oxford series in Ecology and Evolution. So much ecology and fun. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So I was looking at your background, and one thing that really jumped out at me was your work at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, which I'm just going to say is the reason that I got interested in birds.
Oh.
I spent a summer at Rumble, the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, as an undergraduate, and it changed my life.
What year was that?
I can't remember that far back. It was early
We'll
90s.
talk later about
Yeah.
whether we overlapped or not.
Whether or not we overlapped, exactly. But it just goes to show that you've been working in this field of ecology for a very long time, and I would love to know also another aspect of your background is that you started in philosophy, and so I'd love to know your path. How did you get from philosophy to Rumble to the Santa Fe Institute? And
Yes,
what is your drunken walk? Is that?
I think many of us have taken drunken walks and ended up at SFI. When I was in high school, I was a really good science and math student, but I was really bored by how science and math was taught in high school. I thought science and math was about memorizing a bunch of facts and algorithms and regurgitating them. And so I had no idea what science and math really were. So when I went to college, I decided I wanted to go as far away from science and math as I could. I was interested in the history of ideas through time, and I thought, philosophy, I'm going to do philosophy. It also had the fewest requirements and gave me the most freedom to take all kinds of other classes. But it turned out that the part of philosophy that turned me on the most was history and philosophy of science. because that's really where I started getting into this thing about the progression of ideas through time. And so and in this case, scientific ideas. So that's where I got pulled back into science through the back door of philosophy and history, actually.
Philosophy, it's the gateway drug for science.
Apparently, it was for me. But yeah, so that's, by the time I finished, I was like, well, maybe I should go back and get a science degree someday.
And you did. And so what came next?
Yeah, what came next was training. I kind of dove in and decided to train as an ecologist, or to see if that might be the place, because I liked hiking. I was into the environment. I was into trying to understand ecosystems and species and the patterns and dynamics. And so I did a master's at San Francisco State in plant ecology, and then I went to Berkeley, where that's where I got connected to the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. So that's actually, so for almost a decade in the 90s, I was a plant ecologist. And at Rumble, the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, I did experimental field work on how climate change impacts plant communities, alpine plant communities. And we did experimental work. We warmed up, we had heaters over pieces of subalpine meadow. We looked to see how they were impacted over time. And that was all great. And I'm really happy that I got trained as kind of a conventional field experimental ecologist, but I didn't want to just do plants. And so it was kind of during my PhD that I started getting it. I met people who were studying food webs. So who were studying the networks of how species interact with each other through feeding patterns. So I decided to make a shift. And yeah.
And now food webs is one of the main focuses of your work.
Yes, and more broadly, ecological networks in general. But yes, I flipped over after my PhD. I did postdoc part of the time at the Santa Fe Institute and part of the time back in the Bay Area. And that's where I really started kind of getting up to speed on food web research. And the great thing about food webs in ecology is that instead of just focusing on plants or focusing on this kind of animal or microbes, or, there's a lot of, sort of particularity or this system or that system, it tries to grab onto the full diversity of species and how they're interacting, in this case through feeding. So I liked that. Let's look at the whole system, not just a piece of the system, and let's look at all the different organisms.
So let's talk about the reality of doing that work. How do you discover all the things eating each other in an ecosystem?
Right. Well, in principle, it's actually kind of easy, but it's actually, in reality, it's very hard. So all a food web is you go to a particular system, like a lake or a forest or wherever, stream, and you figure out all the different species that exist there. And we actually have a lot of information around the world from different systems of species lists, basically, and species ranges and all that. So that's kind of where you start with. But then the hard part, of course, is trying to fill in who's actually eating whom within that ecosystem. And that, we just kind of get that data in a lot of different ways. There's a ton of data in the literature that you just have to kind of pull and compile. We go to experts and ask them, who have been working in these systems for decades, and we ask them for expert opinion. People do feeding trials, they do gut content analysis. So there's a lot of different ways that people kind of work to try to bring in that, not just the set of nodes, because it's a network, the species are nodes, but what those links are.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine how hard it would be to dig down into the smaller levels. So when you get into the primary producers, right? So plants, but there's even below plants, there's what's going on in the soil.
Yeah, and so a lot of times, so no data set's perfect, and a lot of the empirical side of food web research is sort of unpacking what used to be a black box. So early food web data sets were often like a whole ton of birds and then like insects, like one group called insects, and like plants. but then there'd be like 40 birds down to the subspecies.
Because birds are
Yeah,
awesome.
we
Because
pick one of our
everyone's-
megafauna, right? So, it's cute. It's visually very different.
And it's easy to see.
Yeah.
But increasingly, what we strive for is very high resolution at all the levels of the food web, and and so unpacking that insects into many different kinds of insects like vertebrates, and and in the marine system, on land it's a little easier to identify the different plants, but in the marine system, like what are all the different algae? What are the phytoplankton? And some of those things are still pretty compressed. Pretty coarsely, resolved. But we're always looking for opportunities to pick them apart. One of the things that we picked apart recently, a few years ago, was parasites. So parasites have often been completely neglected by ecologists. Parasitology and ecology kind of develop separately.
Because they're not really eating other animals.
But they are.
They are. They're making use of them.
That's exactly. They're eating them. They're getting.
Yeah.
So all that eating is. So a link in a food web is just if there is biomass that goes from
one to
species
another.
A to species B. So parasites and parasitoids, that's a trophic. It's a feeding interaction. And so we did a whole bunch of work to explicitly include lots and lots of parasites in a set of food webs where we were going to do that. So that was really cool.
How did that affect the perspective on the food web?
Yeah, this is a little interesting science story. The parasitologist kind of came along and said, oh, you all have been ignoring parasites. When we put parasites in, it's going to change everything that you ever thought you knew about food web structure and dynamics. It's like, well,
Let's do it.
that's a hypothesis. Let's test it, right? But they were convinced, and it turns out, at least for some of the things that I looked at, like how the network is structured, so how it's organized, and the different kinds of roles that are played. That adding parasites, and often it doubles the diversity of the food web, and it adds a whole lot more interactions to it. But because the way that food webs and networks in general are structured, that scales systematically with the size of the web. So it turns out that these parasite-laden food webs they looked different in a sense, but when you account for how much bigger they are, it's exactly the kind of structure we would expect to see. So they were kind of like a really big and diversity-enriched version of the smaller parasite-free food webs. That's not to say that there aren't any differences. There's work on kind of dynamics and how, the way that parasites feed is a little bit different, of course, than how a free-living predator feeds. So that can make differences.
What is the predictive power of this field?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by prediction. Of course, that's a so we have different. Ultimately, we would like to be able to sort of get information from particular systems and to do like dynamical modeling in order to kind of understand how major perturbations might impact that system.
Because I'm assuming we're looking at it this from also perspective. We have these coming.
Yeah.
They're already starting to show up.
Well, absolutely, and some of my early work in food webs actually involved doing robustness analyses, but these were in silico experiments, so they were experiments on the computer.
Right.
And where we took real food web data, but then we kind of systematically plucked species out of it, and then use that in order to understand the likelihood of seeing secondary extinctions as you continue to pull species out or lose species, or cascading extinctions. And so, basically doing this across a whole bunch of different data sets, that gave us the ability to sort of generalize, at what point you would expect to start seeing cascading extinctions because of loss of species, regardless of how you lose them, whether it's, due to climate change or habitat destruction.
And I'm hoping it took a really long time.
Yeah.
That you had to pluck a whole lot of them out of there.
It's actually interesting. One of the results out of that is there's a lot of kind of robustness built into these networks. And you actually had to, for the food webs we were looking at, you could pull about 20% of the species and interactions out before you would start to see cascading extinctions. Because at that point you've taken so much of the redundancy out of the networks that, you know, any further loss can cascade. And we actually have now looked at this for a colleague of mine, Justin Yakel, who was a postdoc at SFI and is now at UC Merced. He looked at food webs from ancient Egypt, just little pieces of food webs. So of the mid and large bodied herbivores and carnivores, so mammals, and basically showed over the course of ancient Egyptian history, and they pulled their data actually off of the art of Egypt, because there's a lot of depictions of the mammals that were around at different periods of time. So through that, they were able to put together these little pieces of food webs and look at them all the way over the last 10,000 years, basically, and showed that, you know, starting off, they had 38 species of these herbivores and predators. Now there's only like 8 left. And, you know, so that food web, or that piece of food web, is completely unraveled.
Yeah.
And they also showed, using a different kind of stability analysis, that, you know, as you go through time and you decrease the size of the food web, that it becomes increasingly unstable. And so now we're at a point, you know, in that case and in many other cases, where I think we've started to strip away some of this, you know, kind of protection against future perturbations.
So how does that jive with our understanding of keystone species? Because I know, you know, we understand there are certain species that are like the linchpin in these maps, and when you pull them out, it's not like you can lose 20%. If you take that one out, you can have these immense cascading effects.
Right.
Are you still seeing that with
Yeah,
some
absolutely.
individuals?
And, you know, and I think this, like, network-based approaches provide another way of defining keystones. And so it may be, you know, one of the things that we can do, and we did, is to plug out things depending on how many connections they had. So if you target highly connected species who are, you know, feeding and getting fed on, you know, by many species, that will have a really big impact. You know, if you have fewer connections, that will tend to have less of an impact on the overall structure or the likelihood of having secondary extinctions. But you can have cases where things that are that aren't hubs still can have kind of a disproportionate potential effect and lead to, you know, if you think about it, say, something special, you know, anything that specializes in feeding on two other things. If you lose those one or two other things, boom, you know, those specialists are gone. Generalist feeders, however, they're individually more robust to losses within the network. So there's a lot of interesting things at play.
Yeah, eventually the world is just going to be a world of generalists.
Yeah.
all the specialists dying out. I'd love to, you mentioned looking back at ancient Egypt's food webs. How do you historically go back and look at ancient food webs and then bring them forward and do comparisons through time?
Absolutely. So we're doing this, we've done this in a couple of different ways. So one set of work I've got involved in, which has really been a blast, has been to work with paleobiologists and to actually go back way deep in time into geologic history, go back 500 million years to the Cambrian, which was the major radiation of multicellular life on Earth. So 500 million years ago. What a big number. Super cool. And so actually, by working with experts from the Smithsonian Institution, and other places, we were able to actually put together really pretty good data for, you know, they know what species are there because they're really well preserved in the Burgess Shale and in other Cambrian shales. And then it turns out that you can actually infer a lot from the fossil record about interactions, about who's feeding on who.
How though? You don't have any.
You can't look at the guts, right?
You can actually.
Okay.
Gut
Is there
contents.
poop to be seen?
Yes, there's
Oh my
coprolites. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in the fossil record, so you just named two of them. I mean, gut contents is great, so you actually can get evidence of gut contents in the fossil record, and that's like the smoking gun.
So is that partially digested food that just happened to be preserved at the time that
Yeah,
the organism
exactly.
was preserved?
Or
right?
there's even a case where there's a fish eating a smaller fish that got preserved at the moment when the little fish was in the bigger fish's mouth. Now that doesn't happen that often. But there are coprolites. There's also, you can tell a lot about functional morphology, like what kind of teeth something has.
Oh, yeah.
So you see bite marks, and then you can trace those back to the particular teeth of a particular species. Wow. So there's all this kind of stuff. So we infer every feeding link is a hypothesis. It has one or more lines of evidence associated with it, and we can assign certainty levels, and that allows us to kind of play around, with, sort of different versions of the data set. So.
It's so much fun. And then you started looking at humans' role
Yes.
in food webs, which
Yes.
why did it take so long for us to start asking about what role humans play in ecosystems?
So, again, I think this is sort of, the old school. A lot of science is based on disciplinary research and has been sort of split out, like you have the ecology and the biology and the physics and computer science and social science and psychology and neuroscience. And so there were kind of these boundaries and these silos of knowledge, but I think increasingly the questions that we're most interested in answering require us to completely ignore those boundaries and just to kind of go after the questions. And so in ecology, there is the kind of disciplinary tradition is to study ecosystems in the absence of humans. Like, we want to study pristine ecosystems. Of course, no ecosystem is pristine. We can pretend they are, but they aren't. And so there's so there's been, I think, too much of the let's study them separate from humans. But I think increasingly there's a lot of different lines of research that's looking to integrate different kinds of social science and archaeology and anthropology and economics with ecological understanding. And so I got pulled into a research study up in Alaska in the Aleutian Islands, in a particular piece of the Aleutian Islands, the Sanak Archipelago, near the tip of the Alaska Peninsula, and was asked to be a part of a project with some archaeologists and environmental scientists to see whether we could use a food web type of approach to understand how pre-industrial Aleut hunter-gatherers fit into that system. And so explicitly pull them into an ecological analysis, because we are, in one sense, just another species. In other senses, we're not just another species. But so that was really cool, and it was an experiment. It's like, let's check it out and see what we can do with that.
I feel though, like if we pulled humans out of this web in any given point, outside of maybe raccoons and pigeons, everything would be fine.
That's actually an interesting point that's not always true. And actually, I have a colleague sitting in the audience, Stephanie Crabtree, who just published a study recently that got reported on in the New York Times that talked about, in a very different part of the world, in the western desert of Australia, and looking at the Mardu people. So there is no landscape in Australia separate from humans. Humans have been on that landscape for many tens of thousands of years. There is no sense in which there is an ecology without humans. And Mardu have many practices, but one of their practices is to set small-scale fires in order to enhance their ability to hunt large-bodied lizards for food. The Mardu people were pulled off of the land in the mid-20th century. 1964. Thank you, Stephanie.
We have fact checking.
And very quickly, it deeply and very negatively impacted the ecosystem. There were a lot of extinctions of small-bodied mammals. There were other kinds of effects. And so in recent decades, the Mardu have been returning, allowed to return, and choosing to return to that landscape. And also, it totally changed the fire regime and made for bigger, worse fires, all kinds of environmental and ecological effects. They're now coming back on, assuming their old practices, and it's already having an obvious positive effect. And this is all in the context of, a food web, of which they are a very important part. So you can't, they got pulled out in a weird experiment, and it was bad, so.
I would love you to weigh in on a debate that we have had on this show for a very long time about the reintroduction of mammoths to the planet.
Rewilding.
To Canada.
To Canada specifically. Well, there are Siberian scientists who want to genetically modify or use mammoth DNA, genetically modify elephants and create mammoths again, and then allow them back into the world. And the idea is they'd be in Siberia, they would be back in Canada. These were places where they used to live.
Right.
But they've been gone for a very long time now. So we have had a variety of opinions. Justin thinks, yes, bring them back. They're going to be dispersing seeds, and they're going to be doing all sorts of good things for the environment that maybe has been lost. And Blair and I are kind of like, well, it's been too long.
Yes.
What do you think?
So yeah, the whole issue of rewilding is a very interesting one, and something and it's not just about, bringing old things back, but, what do we do in systems like where wolves were removed?
Yeah.
So I think a more immediate issue in a lot of systems is that we've removed top predators. And the ecologies and environments of those systems has changed drastically as a result of that. And when you reintroduce them, like wolves, or allow them to flourish, like in Yellowstone, it can kind of like when you put humans back in, and the Mardu people in Australia, it can actually help to bring the ecosystem back to a place where it was before. It can enhance diversity. It can enhance ecosystem functioning.
It even changed where the deer would hang out.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
then they were then depositing and creating plant life where it wouldn't have been
Exactly,
before.
and so that's where a food web perspective becomes very handy, because it can help you to start to try to trace the different pathways of effect and impact as you either pull species out or reintroduce species. Now with the mammoths in particular, I think, one of the big issues, of course, is that it is a very different kind of world. I mean, those ecosystems aren't anything like what they used to be. They may even look like it, but they aren't necessarily, and especially under climate warming, you've completely shifted even where mammoths could thrive. Where they thrive may not overlap. I mean, basically, I don't know enough in particular about the mammoth story, but, given how much has changed since mammoths were, on the planet, I mean, there might be easier solutions, like, enhancing bison,
Right.
the ranges of bison, or, because we do know that large herbivores played a very important role on the Great Plains and in other parts of the world. And so, we've lost some of that. But there's also all these issues now about where humans have built up things, and where there are now roads, and where there's development, and how the climate is changing. So I think it's, one thing humans are really good at is screwing up things by introducing technology, species, whatever. We think we know what we're doing, and but often haven't really thought through that network of interaction and impact and effect. And so then all of a sudden you do something, you're like, oh, I'm gonna make things better. And there's all these unintended consequences. And so, but that's not to say I don't think it's impossible to understand that. And in fact, that's why I'm into food web stuff. It's like, there are approaches in using networks and looking at dynamics and structure and function where we can take a more intelligent approach to thinking through some of the consequences of these kinds of questions.
It's one thing in California too is California is covered in grasslands because grass was brought over either intentionally or not, but it fed cattle and sheep and this sort of thing. And California used to have native wildflowers that could handle long droughts. They had taproots that went straight down, and they preserved themselves better.
Right.
So even when we're not talking about large animals, we can even be talking about the plants that we are growing in our local areas that evolved to be there in the first place, and trying to reintroduce those.
At the same time too, I think it's a mistake to want to capture and hold on to some mystical, mythical former Eden.
Well, because we're not going anywhere. So,
and also because humans are a part of the ecosystem.
Nostalgia for the age that never existed.
So I think, we have to sort of let go of this mythical Edenic kind of thinking and sort of grapple with what do we value and how do we achieve that, and how do we, sustain coupled natural human systems, and what is it about them that is most valuable, not just to humans, but to biodiversity and the earth.
I'd love to know about the distinction between a food web and a web of use. It's
yes.
a term that has come up in
Yes,
your work, and I'd love to know
absolutely.
what that is about.
Yeah, so this is the very newest work, and again, my main co-conspirator is in the audience, Stephanie Crabtree. So what we're now doing at a bunch of different systems around the world, all for now pre-industrial systems, we're looking at how humans interacted with species, not just by feeding on them, but humans, of course, interact and use species in a variety of ways. So food's a big one, it's important. But we use them to make clothes, and humans use them to make shelter and for transportation and to make bowls and for trade and taxation, and they use them for ritual purposes, and they figure in their cosmologies. And so what we're doing and no one has ever done this, and so we're actually working to compile comprehensive, detailed data about, in a six very different kinds of systems, all the different ways that the humans in that system interacted with the full range of species in that system. So we're working on the Pacific North Coast, we're working in the southwestern Pueblos, that's one of Stephanie's systems, we're working in French Polynesia, we're working in the North Atlantic Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and Faroes, Neolithic, North Central Europe, and also the Mardu people that we talked about earlier in Australia.
And is this mostly in a context of native peoples and their use of the land,
Yes.
or is this are you hoping at some point that you'll be looking at modern
Absolutely.
urban life,
Still
and
Absolutely.
how we use
Yes, I mean,
land?
I think this could provide a really good framework for. I mean, we want to start with what's a little simpler in a sense,
Right.
kind of pre-industrial, pre-global trade, and sort of try to do a really good job, because there we have a good understanding of the ecologies that people were confronting as they came into these systems, the different kinds of environments and climates, and also all these people have different cultures that they bring, and taboos and norms and modes of production, and so we're really trying to compile this new kind of data for the first time, and then also to understand, are there patterns, are there generalities across the systems where there's differences, how much do those relate to like differences in ecology or differences in climate or differences in culture. So there's a lot we can do, and we want to do it really well for those systems. And also, of course, there's a benefit to looking at systems in the past. We know what happened, and some of the systems that we're looking at didn't have bad outcomes. People came into those systems and there weren't massive extinctions or environmental degradation, but some of them do show signs of degradation after humans came in. So we have this kind of nice lesson from the past where we can try to use that to unpack all these relationships. And then, yes, ultimately, I would love for this to pull this into thinking about the modern world. That I think it could be a powerful framework.
Yeah, I mean, how can we learn sustainable paths from the past that can help us be more sustainable in our use of the ecosystems today?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the little stories I like to tell about this, in the Sinak-Aleut, who were my first study of humans and food webs, they're generalist feeders. Humans tend to be super generalists. That's one of the things that seems to be popping out, not a huge surprise. But they were very ecological in how they were generalists. So ecological generalists, they switch prey all the time. So they may have preferences, and the Sinak-Aleut certainly did. So in the case of the Sinak-Aleut, they preferred to get in their kayaks and go hunt sea lions. But 99% of the time they couldn't do that because the weather was too crappy, and and it's hard to get out there and get the sea lion. And so they would actually then switch to the intertidal, and then they'd eat the big juicy bits out of the intertidal, and then they'd go down in body size. And then when the salmon arrived, they would go to the salmon. Every time they switch, it allows the other populations to recover. That's a very ecological, normal behavior, and it's really stabilizing for the entire ecosystem. And a counterexample is like the sushi industry, and so the market for bluefin tuna.
Yeah.
So in this case, as bluefin tuna, their populations go down drastically as they get hunted for the luxury market. Basically, their ecological value would go down. So like normally you'd switch away from bluefin tuna, but economically in the modern market, their value
still loves it. They want to eat it.
And their value goes way up. Their economic value goes. So the rarer they get, the more expensive they are, and so they keep hunting them down. It's bad for bluefin tuna, but it's also bad for the ecosystem.
Well, there was a number, I think I saw in an article that I read, related to your work that said the most expensive bluefin tuna was purchased for $3 million.
Yeah, I forget the exact number,
One
but
tuna.
millions of dollars. Yes.
So that is not economically sustainable. It's not.
Well, it's not
ecologically
Yeah.
sustainable. And from the ecosystem generalist perspective, though, it also seems like it's, these are hunters of convenience.
Yeah.
It's like what is convenient at the time, and we've moved to the snack culture of convenience where everything is available all the time.
Yeah.
Where, when I was growing up, salmon was a luxury item, and it wasn't something that you could have for any weekend that you wanted. Whereas now, salmon is in all the stores all the time.
Right.
So we are doing things differently now.
Exactly, and I think that's where we can start to learn some interesting lessons by looking at some of these past studies and how humans were a part of their ecosystems and not just exploiting their ecosystem.
I love all of this, and I can't wait to continue to follow your research, mainly because there are two main tenets that I'm always talking to visitors of all ages to about at the zoo where I work during my day job, the San Francisco Zoo. One is that we are part of the system, right? And so if we have made negative impacts, that also means we can make positive impacts.
Yes.
But the second is systems thinking. We can't just save a single species, we have to save a space. And so this is a great kind of hard, easier to view expression of all of that. And I'm really excited to share that back at my institution.
Yeah, that's great. Spread the word.
Yes, my pleasure.
Do you think studies of food webs and webs of use will help us as we start adventuring into the stars?
Yes. And actually there's interesting analogs from the past. So I got pulled into a study based in French Polynesia, and in particular Moorea, next to Tahiti and some of the sister islands. So Polynesians, the ancient Polynesians, spread across thousands of miles of open ocean in canoes and finally colonized the last bits of the earth in the South Atlantic Ocean. From Hawaii down to Polynesia and then New Zealand, just in the last 1,000 years. So that was like the last major wave of human colonization, exploration and colonization on Earth. And so when the ancient Polynesians were in their boats and coming to all these islands, they brought with them a whole little food web and a whole little food system with them. So they brought a bunch of agricultural plants like bananas and taro and breadfruit, but they also brought animals for animal husbandry, pigs and chickens, and also a bunch of hitchhikers that kind of came along for the ride.
The insects, the barnacles, the
yes, absolutely,
various things.
And so they brought these things, and so when they landed, it wasn't just humans coming onto these new ecologies and these new islands. They were bringing a whole little food web with them, and in many cases, kind of slotted in. They brought some new species. They set up new practices. There were instances where there was, kind of negative impacts of humans coming in, but in many cases, in the long run, there hasn't been. So I think there's some interesting things to look at in terms of what do we take into space, and how do we think about food systems and ecologies, not just for food, but for other kinds of purposes. Taking a walk in the woods and being around nature, is increasingly being studied and understood as really important for human health and well-being. And I think certainly this is something that NASA and science fiction writers and people think about quite a bit in terms of how do you create something that's nurturing and that's diverse. We had a panel last year on autonomous ecosystems at Interplanetary where we basically discussed these kinds of issues.
That's fun. I would like to open it up if anyone from the audience has a question right now. Does anyone, you had a question earlier, if you want to shout it over the drum beats?
Sure. I read in a book that mad cow disease might be occurring in elk, like Wyoming and places north and west. How does a disease process like that affect the whole?
So the question is, how does a disease process, something like mad cow in elk that have predator species feeding on them and they're also influencing further down the food web, how does that affect the entire food web?
Yeah, this kind of gets back also to the fact that we're starting to explicitly study parasites in the context of food webs and parasitoids and also diseases. I have colleagues who actually look at these kinds of questions, and in particular are also looking at, what it means as viruses or parasites are jumping from animal to animal, and so new animals are becoming reservoirs, and then potentially bringing that into new food webs and also impacting humans, but also impacting other species. So it's an area of very active and I think interesting and important research, because also as the climate changes, that changes where certain kinds of parasites can be at what times, and so we have diseases moving northward, in some cases like into the U.S. and other moderate climate areas that never used to, exist in those places. So I think it's a really important big issue.
It's huge. Any other questions from anybody in the audience? Yes.
Does cannibalism affect, how would cannibalism affect a food web?
Yes.
How would cannibalism affect a food web?
So,
that's a fascinating question.
I'm really glad you brought cannibalism up. Cannibalism, it's really common, and so and actually most food web data sets right now underrepresent cannibalism. And a little fun factoid that people don't realize is that mammals, including humans, are obligate cannibals because they feed their young with the milk of the mother. So it's a biomass transfer. It's not about, cannibalism isn't just about
the Donner Party.
Yeah, exactly.
It was one toe. It was one toe.
Anytime you have a biomass transfer, it's a feeding link. And so we are obligate cannibals. But, funny kidding aside, it's an important part of the dynamics that, actually we think about quite carefully, especially as we model dynamics. It's important because you have a lot of times also where older, like the stage structure. Most species have stage structure where there's smaller things turn into bigger things. They may transform completely, like the butterfly, the caterpillar, the butterfly. But there's many cases, especially among insects, where the older ones will eat the younger ones if they have access to them. And it's not just insects. But so it's clearly an important part of the dynamics, and also in some cases populations self-regulate through cannibalism, in ways that are actually enhance the ability of the species and the population to thrive. So it's a very interesting.
And I think we are the largest growing species on the planet, so we might need to watch out for this. This might just start showing up. It's a natural counter for a population.
I would love to thank you for joining us today, Dr. Dunne. This has been
Thank you for
fascinating.
inviting me.
Where can people find out more information about your work?
Yes, please, to find out more about my work, go to the Santa Fe Institute website. And there's I have a little web page and bio there, but if you just Google Santa Fe Institute, you can look for me or Google my name, and it'll connect you to different resources like Google Scholar and Researcher ID, where you can get my papers and, look at what I've been up to. You can also email me.
Email's wonderful for connecting with people.
Yes.
All right, everybody, we will have links for all of these things on our website. We have quick stories to end the show with. 5 minutes, can we do this? Really quickly, and then we're gonna round this show out. So I would love everybody to know that there are researchers in Stanford, chemists, that are using venom from scorpions to identify and now synthesize healing compounds that can combat antibacterial resistant compounds. So bacteria like staph and also other bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. There are new compounds found in scorpion venom that may kill off those organisms.
So you're just milking individual scorpions?
No, not milking. So that is what they have to do currently, is milk little scorpions, and it takes a long time and is very difficult to do. So instead of milking the scorpions, the chemists have figured out how to synthesize these molecules so that now they could be made and manufactured at scale. Additionally, as we move into space, robots are going to be helping us. I mean, they're going to be helping us a lot more and more here on our planet, but also in space. But if you're going to be sharing space with a robot, you don't want that robot to hurt you. So there is a new algorithm at work. Researchers from MIT have created an algorithm that accurately aligns trajectories of human bodies to determine what people are going to be doing so that robots don't run into them and injure them. And so instead of on a factory floor, for instance, when a robot would go motionless just because a human is present, now the robot can modify its own movements and continue the work that it's doing without having to stop what it's doing just because there's a person around.
No.
And this
we
also
need the
could
light
mean-
curtain.
this
the
could
light
also
curtain that
mean-
shuts down the robot immediately. You want this. You do not. No.
Yeah, I mean, this predictive behavior could also help them destroy us.
Humans are not predictive. That's the problem.
Yeah, unsubscribe
the
on that
us
one,
part.
for sure,
yes.
yeah.
All right, moving on up.
I have a fun story about mantis shrimps. As we know, there are two kinds of mantis shrimps. There's the stabby and the smashy. And the smashy ones have the impact equal to a .22 caliber bullet. So they have looked at the structure of their telson, the tail armor that they have that can withstand that smash. And they were able to take the spearing telson and manipulate it to become as strong as the smashing one, which means they have figured out how to potentially make a armor that we could wear that would have a similar protective, lightweight, durable effect, which is pretty cool.
Bike helmet.
Yes, bike helmets, all sorts of other good things. But my kind of far out space related story that I absolutely loved is a satellite that is both a rideshare and a Lego. So the Vega launcher from Europe has now been equipped with a particular way of carrying a bunch of teeny tiny satellites all at once. They can carry, in September they're doing a proof of concept flight, and they are carrying 41 separate satellites, 7 small satellites and 35 CubeSats in all, and the pieces are interlocking and switchable just like Legos, so you could load up the Vega launcher with all these different satellites of different numbers and sizes, as long as they're small, and launch them into space. And they are crowdsourcing via each of these individual satellites from different interest groups that want to send something out into space to cut the cost of launching into space.
As long as
there's a rideshare and a Lego and a satellite.
As long as they don't forget to have a robotic arm with teeth on it, because this is how my kids always get the Lego parts apart. You gotta have something to.
You gotta have that orange piece. Yeah.
Or the little tool.
Yeah.
Discovering pterodactyls that they could fly from birth. This is not something that we thought they could do, because we modeled them after birds and bats, and it turns out, nope, they can actually, as soon as they hatch, they can fly. And I love the quote here. This is actually most of the reason of the story. David Unwin says, theoretically, what pterosaurs did is impossible. But they didn't know this, so they did it anyway.
Go pterosaurs.
Also, fun fact, baby pterodactyls are called flaplings. Wow, as if they weren't already cute.
Now I want a flapling, and may we all be pterodactyls.
Yes.
May we all be pterosaurs. That brings us to the end of our show. I would like to say thank you to all of you who have joined us here today. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Interplanetary Festival and to the Santa Fe Institute for bringing us to Santa Fe, New Mexico. We're having such a wonderful time. Jennifer Dunne, thank you for joining us on the show once again. Thank you to our online followers, and I would love to say thank you to our Patreon sponsors. Thank you to Paul Disney, Richard Onimus, Ed Dyer, Ed, Andy Groh, Stu Pollock, Philip Shane, Ken Hayes, Harrison Prather, Charlene Henry, Joshua Fury, Steve DeBell, Alex Wilson, Tony Steele, Craig Landon, Mark Mazaros, Jack, Matthew Lutman, Jason Robert, Bill K., Bob Calder, Time Trooper 319, Eric Knapp, Richard Brian Condren, Dave Neighbor, David Williams, Corinne Benton, Adam LaJoy, Sarah Chavis, Rodney, Tiffany Boyd, John Bertram, Mountain Sloth, Seth O'Gradney, Stefan Aldebaran, John Ratnaswamy, Steve Friedel, Dave Friedel, Daryl Myshak, Andrew Swanson, Paul Ronovich, Sue Dosser, Dave Wilkinson, Ben Bignell, Richard Porter, Noodles, Kevin Reardon, Christoph Zuchnarek, Ashish Pant, Ulysses Adkins, Artyom, Rick Mavis, Paul, John McKee, Jason Olds, Brian Carrington, Christopher Dreyer, Lisa Suzuki, Jim DePoe, Greg Riley, Sean Lamb, Ben Rothick, Steve Leastman, Kurt Larson, Rudy Garcia, Marjorie, Gary S., Robert Burgett, Greg Briggs, Brendan Minish, Christopher Rappin, Flying Out, Aaron Luthen, Matt Sutter, Mark Hassenflow, Kevin Parachan, Byron Lee, and E.O. Woo! Wow. Get it all out. And I hope that I can read more people's names after today. And I would like to say thank you to Fada for helping us with social media and show notes and Identity for when he helps us record the show. You can find us at This Week in Science online, twis.org/live on Wednesday evenings at 8 p.m. Pacific time. We broadcast every week, bringing science and interviews to the web. We'll be back again there next week. And if you can't make it, you can always find past episodes at our YouTube channel. Just look twis.org. That's where you'll find us.
Thank you for enjoying the show. TWIS is also available as a podcast. Just Google This Week in Science in your iTunes directory, or if you have a mobile type device, you can look for TWIS or This Week in Science in the mobile type card catalog, wherever that's located.
Yeah. For more information on anything you heard here today, if you want show notes on all of the articles we brought your way today, those are available on our website. Once again, that's twis.org. While you're there, you can also make comments on those show notes. You can start conversations with us or other listeners.
Or you can ignore the other listeners and contact us directly. Email Kirsten at thisweekinscience.com, Justin at twistminion@gmail.com, or Blair at blairbaz@twis.org. Just be sure to put TWIS, TWIS, somewhere in the subject line. Otherwise, what'll happen, Blair?
Oh, your email will be spam filtered
into oblivion. You can also hit us up on the Twitter, where we are at TWIS Science, at Dr. Kiki, at JacksonFly, and at Blair's Menagerie. We love your feedback. If there is a story you would like us to cover or address, a suggestion for an interview, a haiku that comes to you in the night, please let us know.
I will also mention that since we're at a festival, at Shouty Blair has showed back up in the Twitterverse. So if you want to be shouted at on Twitter, you can check that out.
She shouts.
She shouts.
She's all caps all the time.
All caps all the time. And as we mentioned, we will be back next week, Wednesday, on the internet, and we hope you'll join us again for more great science news.
And if you've learned anything from this show, remember,
it's all in your head. We did it! Thank you for joining us!
Science is the end of the world, so I'm setting up shop. Got my banner unfurled. It says the scientist is in. I'm gonna sell my advice. Show them how to stop the robots with a simple device. I'll reverse global warming with a wave of my hand, and all it'll cost you is a couple of grand. 'Cause this week's science is coming your way, so everybody listen to what I say. I use the scientific method for all that it's worth, and I'll broadcast my opinion all over the earth. 'Cause it's This Week in Science, This Week in Science, This Week in Science, 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 Science. This Week in Science, This Week in Science, This Week in Science, 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 Science. I've got one disclaimer and it shouldn't be news, that what I say may not represent your views, but I've done the calculations and I've got a plan. If you listen to the science, you may just understand that we're not trying to threaten your philosophy. We're just trying to save the world from jeopardy. This Week in Science is coming your way, so everybody listens to everything we say. If you use our method instead of rolling a die, we may rid the world of toxoplasma. Got the eye. This Week in Science, This Week in Science, This Week in Science, 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 Science. This Week in Science, This Week in Science, This Week in Science, 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 Science. listen to what we say. The word that we say, then please just remember it's all in your head. Cause it's This Week in Science, This Week in Science, This Week in Science, 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 This Week in Science, This Week in Science, This Week in Science, 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 This Week in 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 Science, This Week in
She's a science communicator.
Okay. Hi. No, I'm
Blair's in San Francisco. What are you doing? I can't remember. You're a zoologist.